Welcome back to part 3 of my interview with Dr. Jack Kruse. Welcome to the HealthCast Now podcast. Join host Kevin Cottrell as he interviews thought leaders and world-class experts with a focus on demystifying and deconstructing complex health and wellness topics. Each episode has a focus on achieving optimized circadian health and wellness and is designed to provide actionable tips and information that you can apply to your everyday lifestyle. Please remember our disclaimer. The materials and content discussed within the HealthCast Now podcast are the opinions of Kevin Cottrell and or the guests interviewed. This information is intended as general information only for listeners of the podcast. Listeners should always seek professional advice, and the content and opinions expressed on the podcast should never be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Welcome back to another episode of HealthCast Now. I am host Kevin Cottrell. Joining me today on the podcast is Dr. Jack Kruse, neurosurgeon extraordinaire and industry challenger. I've asked Jack to come on and talk to me about 5G, EMF, and the huge inflection point that we're about to hit with the rollout nationwide in markets on 5G. And some context for this, I talk about this on the episode with Jack, is he was way ahead of himself at Paleo Fx in 2012, where he talked about blocking blue light and circadian disruption. And my personal opinion is we're at that same point now with the rollout of 5G from a health and wellness standpoint. Dr. Kruse comes on and he and I talk in this 3-part series about the basis for 5G, why it's a big challenge, and the fact that we should be paying attention to this and how it's going to manifest itself in terms of illnesses, chronic disease, and health and wellness. He does a great job of explaining the why and why he's, as a neurosurgeon, is very concerned about the effects of 5G. And it's not what you're seeing in the scare tactic pieces that are out there on social media. It's not what you see in the common news articles. But for those of you who follow HealthCast Now and believe in circadian biology and optimization and believe in mitochondrial health, you're going to want to dive in deep. The first episode is going to give you some homework. There are several blog posts where before you get into part 2 and part 3, you're probably going to want to stop and listen to them. They will be in the show notes as well. So please stay tuned for my interview with Dr. Jack Kruse. Welcome back to part 3 of my interview with Dr. Jack Kruse. The thing that really got my attention was how you laid out 5G and the intensity and the comparison, because I think people think of, Jack just mentioned earlier in the discussion, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. 5G is such a big step up. You've touched on it, but it blew me away the way you laid it out, especially as you talk about 24 to 90 billion waves per second. And then you compared that to 2 or 3G. It's such an order of magnitude, and that's not even a good analogy because it's so much bigger.
Yeah, it's so much bigger. Just so people know what you're referencing, normally the human body we radiate about 8 to 10 hertz per second. Wi-Fi that people are using today, probably to listen to this podcast when it goes live, operates at 2.45 gigahertz. So people understand what that means. That's 2.45 billion waves are hitting your eardrums, your skin, your gut, your brain, as you listen to this over an unwired network. Okay? 5G operates at 24 gigahertz to 80 gigahertz. That's one problem. So you can see that is a 20-fold to almost 10,000-fold increase compared to where Wi-Fi or Bluetooth is. But here's the real problem. And I've only just got into this recently. 5G has another big problem that the engineers have to deal with. Actually, physically, what the waveform looks like in the 5G network is radically different than what it was in 1G, 2G, 3G, and 4G. And the reason why, maybe we'll talk about this some other time, the reason why 5G has got me so incredibly worried, the power density that we just talked about between 24 and 80 billion cycles per second is one thing. But the one that's got me really freaked out is I've really studied the waveforms of 5G, and they are completely alien. So everybody's clear on this. When we send the astronauts up into space, they all come back sick for a variety of different things. But the waveforms that are up there come from the sun. That's the solar plasma. And we know that that pretty much follows the electromagnetic spectrum of stars that we know. The one that's here in 5G has been made by man, by engineers, and they've taken RF and microwaves and changed the waveform such that it can carry huge amounts of energy and information so that you can watch, your movies really, really fast. But the way they change the waveform is going to have a massive effect on the topology of how cells work. And when I say that, for you to truly understand what I just said, because this will probably go right over your head, like what I was trying to tell Rob Wolf and Chris Kresser back in 2011 went over their head then. If you don't understand topology, you will not understand why I am so freaked out about 5G, because topology is really a branch of mathematics and science that's focused on the fundamental size and shape of things as they change. And as soon as I said that, you should probably stop and think, okay, what is really Alzheimer's? What is Parkinson's? What is any neurodegenerative disorder or even dementia? You all know that they're associated with proteins that have different sizes and shapes. We call them tau proteins, Parkin proteins. They're all different names. Well, guess what? It's clear from the changes that we've seen in neurodegeneration between a 0G and a 4G network that you can still develop topology changes in those networks. My belief in a 5G world that we're going to have massive amplification of sizes and shape changes, not only on proteins, but also on mitochondria. And one of the things that we know from mitochondrial medicine, from the work of Doug Wallace, is that when you change the topology of a mitochondria, that's when the shit hits the fan. That's when diseases can come out of nowhere. Literally, you can be healthy one week and walk into a place and immediately drop to your knees. And this is very similar to what people report when they take fluoxetine drugs. When they walk into, say, a certain TV or radio station, they get horrible tinnitus. Or they walk into, say, an airport, and they don't know why they feel really bad, or they'll develop orthostatic hypotension. They'll develop autonomic problems. Or you could be like Carrie Fisher and go on a plane and have a massive heart attack when you have a circumpolar flight. Or, kind of like Nene Leakes, who's a famous actress on a reality show who got a DVT. Or a guy like that ex-basketball player, he used to play for the Heat. I'm blanking on his name, Chris something. A young guy, traveled all over the world, also got a DVT on a plane. And these things, no one links them back to the environment. Why? Because the paradigm of medicine teaches people from a biochemistry perspective that the defect is inside of us. And really what the science of epigenetics since 2003 has taught me to realize is that instead of looking inside of us for the defect, the first thing that a mitochondriac quantum clinician needs to do is to look in the environment at the photoelectric instructions that are used to run our epigenetic program and change it. What happens, it turns out those light frequencies can awaken the genetic code in us that's buried deep below the double helix of DNA, and actually can change the way the topology of a cell works, because the topology of a cell works on something called a Dirac fermion. And if you go to the Time 24 blog, when you see I mentioned Dirac fermions, if you want to know what it looks like, there's a picture that I start that blog with, and I want you to look at it. And it turns out, when you look at that picture, I want you to think about your own skin or your own gut, or say your dura mater. That's also a Dirac fermion surface. And when you can induce huge electric and magnetic flux on that surface, you induce massive changes. And one of the things that we talked about already in this podcast, I told you that 5G has this really queer way of operating where you can get jump conduction. That means that you can lean against a lamppost that's got a 5G antenna on it, or stand on a manhole cover and literally get electrocuted with either a negative electric force, positive electric force, a negative magnetic force, or a positive magnetic force. And it can induce literally massive changes in the size and shapes of proteins and substrates within your mitochondrial matrix immediately. And you will be brought to your knees. And this is going to make a lot of people sick. And it's going to be kind of sickness where it doesn't make any sense. When a doctor opens up his pathology book, there's not going to be a description for this kind of problem. Because remember, most of the description problems that we have in pathology and medicine are based over an empiric description of the disease. And that's part of the reason why on this podcast in the past, I mentioned to Kevin before that in my Robbins pathology book in 1986, it said that, you'll probably never see Hashimoto's thyroiditis because it only makes up 1% of cases. But yet today in 2018, it makes up 96.8% of cases of hypothyroidism. Tell me how things changed in 40 years from 1% to almost 100%. It's not a genetic change. It's an epigenetic change. And what changed that? The light frequencies that we allow around us. That's the real ticket. And when someone has a disease like that, it's a sign to me that their environment is toxic in some way. And it really frustrates people when I tell them that because they don't have the biohacking tools to understand what to look for. They don't understand what stone to look under. And it gets really complicated when they go see other doctors, like functional medicine doctors, that tell them, hey, just don't eat eggs. You'll be fine. That's the kind of nonsense that we really have to get people away from. And the reason why I'm stepping on the gas right now and calling people out left and right goes back to what my own members told me in January, that I need to get this message out. I need to talk about this before the inflection point happens this time, because when it happens, you're going to see it and you're not going to understand it. But the more you see of it, the more you're going to realize, maybe I need to learn about this stuff. Maybe I need to do something about it. The point that I will make, it happened the other day when I watched the president have all these kids in the Oval Office to talk about this school shooting. The real issue that we all need to kind of understand, we need to see the problem in a different way. And we have to realize that 5G is the ultimate Dunning-Kruger effect for biology, meaning that it's going to unmask some of the most amazing things that we're ever going to find out in medicine. I mean, there is actually a benefit to guys like me. I'm going to learn a lot about the quantum mechanisms in cells when I see people come in. The problem is that most of the patients that get sick and most of the doctors that take care of patients are not going to have a clue what's going on, because they don't realize the levers that control the biochemical pathways in us are all controlled by light frequencies. And these light frequencies are going to race around because they jump conduct on a 5G network between your heart, your gut, your brain, and it's going to happen on a second-to-second basis depending on where you are in that environment. Really, your only key mechanism is you need to get out of that environment. And the point that I'd make is the reason why I don't think people understand the school shootings is, now we've got teachers that teach by iPads and laptops. We have cell phone towers on the top of schools. Every single kid in the school now has a phone. In fact, my son, when he was in college, he told me that in certain of his physics classes, they didn't have books for him to buy because everything was on the cloud. In other words, the kids had no other option in order to learn than to be driven to technology and the power grid. And my concern for all of you listening to this is that we don't realize that this thing we call progress is pushing us to the precipice. It's pushing us to the edge. And there's going to be some of us that see this. In other words, we're going to be like those T-Rexes that saw the asteroid coming. Some of us will be able to navigate and mitigate the pathways, but most of us won't, because most of the people that are out there will never hear this podcast. They'll probably never hear it in time, much less understand it, because somebody who really doesn't understand what the topology is, what a topologic insulator is, how it works with light, will never understand the things we're talking about here. And just so everybody knows, physics just gave the Nobel Prize for topology and topologic insulators in 2016. We're talking literally a year and a half ago. So I have no illusions that most of the people out there, especially doctors and researchers, who are studying things of which they know very little about are going to ever be able to control in their methodology these things. And, we just saw an example of it. There was a study done that was funded actually by Gary Taubes and Peter Attia about the low carb versus high carb diet. And what did it show? It kind of blew up the paradigm on both sides. It said that food really doesn't control anything, that, weight loss isn't tied to either one. And when it got published, who had the biggest smile on their face? I did. Because what did I say back then, Kevin? I told every single one of them that it wasn't a food story. It's a mitochondrial story. And the problem is, if you don't control your environment to pay attention to these things, you'll never get to the bottom of the problem.
Isn't that interesting? Because, we're back to that inflection point again. So you mentioned environmental being the top of the mitigation. I've heard you talk about the fact that in your posts recently that NASA doesn't have the right answer. What, in addition to environment, in other words, very specifically, if you're in a place like where I live currently, and you know that obviously this is something that I'm paying attention to, I'm in Austin. And as a side note, I can tell you that all of the kids are issued Chromebooks now. I saw Meg sign a release to get a Chromebook in the hand of her 16-year-old just this week. And they're giving them to all the kids, and all the homework is moving online. Wasn't that interesting considering Austin's a 5G rollout in the past 6 months? But mitigation, if you worry about it from an environment, what else should people be focused on? I've heard you mention cold. I've heard you mention seafood. Let's tie that down for listeners.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be very honest with you. I've talked about, the leptin prescription and cold ad nauseum because those were things that were really operational in a 0 to 4G world. Those things are going to help. 5G, it's a totally different ballgame. Those are the things now that I'm talking about on the Patreon blog. The first 2 blogs that I've released literally, and I'm talking hot off the press, is in the last week or so. I released CPC, and just for the people listening to this know what CPC means. This will show you that I haven't got too far away from my neurosurgery roots. CPC stands for Clinical Pathologic Conferences, because that's what we used to call our conferences when we had discussions about how to mitigate risk for patients. So CPC 15 and CPC 16 were just released in the last 7 or 8 days, both of them. And I released them pretty fast because these are specific mitigation strategies for people who begin to start to sense that their environment is really bad. These are the things that you need to start to do immediately. And this is the point that I was trying to make before I kind of blanked on it. In the president's office, when the families were there, one of the fathers that stood up to Mr. Trump said that we can't rely on the government to fix this problem. We have to fix it ourselves. And I have to say, Kevin, that's exactly what my message would be for people who consider themselves a mitochondriac or are worried about this, that we no longer can worry about the doctors, the FCC, the government, or big technology to fix the problems we're going to face in the 5G world. The reason for that is if you try to do this through a political means, it's going to take too long and you're going to get too sick. You now need to realize that you need to take things in your own hand and protect yourself. And the number one protection scheme for you is to use the inverse square law. And the inverse square law basically states that the further you get away from the point source of irradiation, the best it is. And it's very common sense because most people know about it, like in the example I gave earlier about the x-ray machine. Most people know the closer you get to the point source in x-ray, the more x-rays you're going to get. The further you get away, the better it is. The problem with the 5G network that we really haven't talked about yet, and if anybody's been to the cities I mentioned, I'm sure you can talk about this, Kevin, and maybe even in the show notes, you can take some pictures of it. On a city block in a 5G network, you have to have 5G repeaters. There's usually 3 or 4 repeaters on one block. So what does that mean? It means that the antennas have to get closer to the point source. The point source is not only the network, but it's also the cell phone or laptop that connects to it. So that means the 2 big risks for the person is going to be the bidirectional microwave device you connect to the internet with, or how it's wired in your house. If you use wireless in a 5G network, you're basically inviting jump conduction into everything within the electric power grid. So it's effectively as far as I'm concerned, like equivalent to standing in front of a fluoro machine and turning on the power and just not caring. And obviously, the ionization potential of 5G is not what X-rays would be, but that's not the point. The point is the power density, because it mixes topology of waveforms, is nothing that we've ever used in the electromagnetic spectrum. And that's the real concern. And because the engineers have absolutely no biologic background, they have no idea what these waves are going to do to the way cells are organized from a quantum biologic perspective. I do. I happen to know a little bit about both of these things. And I'm telling people that this is the inflection point in the network. And the reason why I'm happy about it is because, A, I think it's going to be the tipping point where the FCC and the government realize, okay, maybe we went too far. And B, I think if they don't get the message, they're going to go bankrupt because so many people are going to get sick. Because remember, they want total control of the healthcare system. Well, if they get total control, they're not going to like what they get, because my prediction is in a 5G world, probably within 5 or 10 years, we'll have so many sick people very early in life that the system will completely collapse upon itself. Even though technology is wildly profitable, the part that's sucking the energy out of the economy is that people are getting sicker quicker, their health span is shrinking, and longevity is now beginning to shrink. And the part of the equation I don't know from a mathematics side is actually when the economy truly begins to tank because of the manpower issue that's present. The reason I mention this here is because in the beginning of this podcast, I talked already that the U.S. military is seeing this manpower because they cannot make a fit army anymore. That's a huge statement. And if the military, who can draft people or have them sign up, can't find a fit army, how is Google going to outfit their algorithms and Facebook, say in 5 or 10 years, when they can't find a 25 or 35-year-old guy to be able to think properly? Because they're all undergoing some state of cognitive de-evolution. This is the real issue. This is going to be a very uncomfortable podcast for people to listen to because, A, when you hear it and it bothers you, you're going to say there's no way this guy's right.
Well, and Jack, to your point, I always hate to make these comments because you're the neurosurgeon and often you'll correct me, which I really appreciate. But your whole discussion that you've done on many blogs about the dangers, and this will go with your 5 to 10 years and the wild card in this, of the population that is myelinating, right? The kids, the teenagers, all the way up to about 20, 22 years old are most at risk, if I understood correctly, from a neurosurgeon's perspective. And we don't, number one, as you said, we don't know what's going to happen with these new waveforms and the 5G. The one thing you can look at is the population in that demographic is potentially most at risk because they're not fully myelinated. Is that correct?
That point is great. I wrote about that in several blog posts that you guys can look up. I think it was one is the Ubiquination 1 blog post, but there's another one that talks about how the infant brain is different than the adult brain. And here's the irony. Because I know I've made this analogy several times, but I want you to think about this because it may kind of shock you. We've done a really good job in this country pointing out in the last 2 weeks how bad an AR-15 is in a school. And we seem to have a problem with acute lead toxicity from a semi-automatic weapon, but we have absolutely no problem chronically irradiating millions of teenagers in their schools with cell phones, with laptops. So realize that the chronic use of technology allows your body to increase its deuterium content and cause heavy metal toxicity. Remember, lead is a heavy metal. So it's okay to chronically destroy brains, but it's not okay to do it acutely. What kind of message is that? Is that a congruent message or an incongruent one? And the thing is, I look at this very differently than most people do. My personal beliefs right now, not that I thought we were going to get into this, but I think based on what I'm talking about in this podcast, that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect a population from its government, from the tyranny of government due to your liberty. What I'm basically saying is that the 1996 FCC law that allowed us to open up the spectrum and begin to auction it off is the tyranny of the government. And what I'm saying very clearly is that the government didn't know the risks fully. They knew some of them. But when at the last minute, one of our state representatives, Billy Tozin, put in the bill that none of the big tech companies could ever be held liable for what Philip Morris was held liable for the tobacco litigation, that to me made me realize that there is some evil forces out there behind the tech movement. And I'm very, very happy to hear that some of these people that have made millions of dollars on these companies are beginning to realize that there's a bad connotation to tech. And I guess the reason I've decided to do this podcast with you now is so that this message can get out there, because most of the people listening to this, I don't think they're going to get the full implications of what I'm saying. But much like what happened at Paleo Fx, I bet you a year and a half or 2 years from now, when some of the things in this manifest further to their liking, when they have to get clubbed over the head, when they see this stuff happening all around them in their own schools, in their own communities, they're going to remember where the problem is. And then the key thing is turn off the power grid and turn off the tech. Use it only when you need it, but don't keep it on 24/7. Certainly don't keep it anywhere near you. Try to stay as far away from it as you can. Try to move out to where population density is less, because guess what? What's the 5G issue? Population density, the obedient idiots around you. Like, for example, if you live in a condo and you've got 50 smart meters on a building, there's no way for you to mitigate any. I don't give a shit if you have 19 Magneticos, a ton of supplements from Dave Asprey, and a Thor red bed. It ain't gonna work, people. You need to understand that. The best mitigation strategy for you is your own brain to realize what we talked about today means that you have to move away from the point sources of the radiation coming to you and you moving towards it. Why? Because the 5G network is a bidirectional microwave RF complex waveform that is going to be unbelievably powerful in terms of what it can do technology-wise, but it's going to be unbelievably powerful in what it can do taking you apart.
And that's great advice. Jack, before you drop off today, if people want to get more information on social media, you've got a blog, you maintain a Facebook page. How would they find you?
Yeah, the easiest way is to start out for most of the free information, and there's a ton of it on my form at my website. It's jackkruse.com. And then if you want the blogs, the new blogs especially, for about the last 6 months, they are on a new site called Patreon. They're included in membership. So if you become a gold, silver, or platinum member, they're included in your membership. There's no extra cost. If you just want to sample Jack Kruse via the Patreon blogs, you can join that and become a patron. The other way, if you want to cut through the first 3 to 4 years of the blog that's published, that's free out there, you can read my book on Amazon called The Epi Paleo RX. And for any of the ideas, like I would say, kind of what Kevin talked about today, when I bring some of these points to bear, you can find that on my Dr. Jack Kruse Facebook page. I usually have my web people post some really interesting things that are occurring around the world, and I put some commentary on those for you. I usually do it once a week and release them on a scheduled basis. And the reason I do it is for what Kevin told you guys about today, that when I post this stuff, I'm trying to be provocative. I'm trying to disturb you. I'm trying to make you feel uncomfortable so that I can make you curious. Make you curious so that you actually want to learn about why 5G may be the next inflection of blue light. Blue light's bad enough, but I got news for you guys. 5G is kind of like being in Hiroshima and looking up and seeing the tip of a nuclear bomb.
That's a great way to leave people with a lot to think about.
Hey, no problem.
Thanks for being on the podcast, Jack. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Healthcast Now podcast. We hope that you enjoyed this episode and will visit us on iTunes and like and rate this episode and give us some feedback on the content. You can also subscribe to Healthcast Now on iTunes to ensure you never miss an episode. We value your opinion and input. We'd love to hear from you regarding Healthcast Now and how much you're enjoying the content. You can write a review and let us know what you think. For show notes and additional resources related to this or any other Healthcast Now episode, please visit our podcast website, www.healthcastnow.com. We look forward to having you join us again on the next episode of Healthcast Now.